Welcome to all listeners of my presentation on Guido Adler and the Eclectic Origins of Musicology, which was held at the 87th annual meeting of the American Musicological Society as part of the session Scrutinizing the History of Music Studies. My paper presents findings of my ongoing research project Creating an Academic Discipline, Eduard Hanslick, Guido Adler, and the Establishment of Musicological Methodology in 19th century Austria, conducted at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, the Department for Art History at Masaryk University Brno, and the Austrian Centre for Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage at the Austrian Academy of Sciences as part of an Erwin-Schrödinger-Fellowship funded by the Austrian Science Fund FWF. Over the next 20 minutes, my presentation will explore the scholarly, political, and socio-cultural setting of one of the most significant contributions to the early stages of musicology's methodological consolidation. Guido Adlers Umfang, Methode und Ziel der Musikwissenschaft, or Scope, Method and Aim of Musicology. Adler's essay was published in 1885 as the opening standalone article of Vierteljahresschrift für Musikwissenschaft, or Musicology Quarterly, the first journal devoted exclusively to musicological scholarship, edited by Adler in collaboration with Friedrich Chrysander and Philipp Spitta. This text is frequently considered the earliest attempt at providing a systematic framework to the nascent discipline of musicology, a view shared by Spitta, for example, who had initially wished for the inaugural volume to open with a text by Chrysander as the senior editor, but conceded after publication that Adler's essay had been the right way to go. It gives, Spitta wrote to Adler, a complete, well-designed program for the tasks to be accomplished by musicology, and it gives such a program to my knowledge for the first time. It is very well suited to ground our claim that musicology is an independent science on par with the others. What does it mean, however, to consider Adler's essay a contribution to the early stages of musicology as a standalone field of scholarship? Pinpointing the actual origin of musicology is a difficult enterprise. This difficulty largely stems from a considerable amount of ambiguity when using the term musicology and its German counterpart Musikwissenschaft, or science of music. In the course of my talk, I will use the term musicology in a comprehensive understanding as the equivalent to the German concept of Musikwissenschaft. While academic curricula other than the Austro-German model might further differentiate musicology into fully fledged individual subdisciplines, I will use the term as an umbrella concept for academic musical research comprising ethnomusicology, music theory, historical and systematic musicology, and so on. As becomes evident from this brief caveat, the problem in dating the beginnings of musicology turns on the question as to what constitutes musicology. Apart from matters related to particular academic conventions, this question pertains to the basic issue of which factors differentiate musicology from more specific research endeavors, such as, say, music history, biographical investigation, or aesthetics, from which much of musicology historically derives. How one decides to answer these questions has a huge impact on determining the beginnings of the discipline. Lectures on music history at German-language universities, for example, can after all be traced back at least to Lorenz Christoph Mitzler, who taught music history at Leipzig University from 1736 onward, followed by Johann Nikolaus Forkel in Göttingen and Daniel Gottlob Türk in Halle, who both were appointed as music directors to their respective universities in 1779. Besides tending to the musical life of their institution and educating musicians practically, music directors were also supposed to teach music from a scholarly perspective, bridging the gap between practice and theory. Why then all the talk about musicology establishing itself in the middle of the 19th century and Adler's essay of 1885 presenting one of the earliest attempts at systematizing the field as such? Answering this question once more goes hand in hand with problems of definition. As opposed to various university systems in which music education, performance, and musicology are closely linked until today, in German language academia, Musikwissenschaft is generally conceived as a purely scholarly discipline detached from practical music making. Music scholars might perform music, of course, and in some cases are indeed expected to. Think about lute music research, for instance, which is often coupled with performance. But their profession is the scholarly exploration of music, scholarship for the sake of scholarship, so to speak, which can be linked to, but is not in the service of, musical practice. Rosemary Golding, for example, in her work on the development of musicology in Great Britain, makes use of the conceptual distinction between music as science and music as art in order to trace the disentanglement of musicology and musical practice, which in the British context dates to the middle of the 20th century. Taking this definition as our point of departure, the institutional establishment of musicology indeed takes place in the second half of the 19th century. In the Austrian context, which naturally is of particular relevance to Adler's model, this date is closely linked to the failed revolution of 1848, in the wake of which state authorities were pressed to overhaul and modernize university education, which had fallen behind the standard of Germanic academia, especially the university reforms associated with Alexander von Humboldt in Berlin. As a result, abstract philosophical aesthetics was divided into individual disciplines devoted to specific branches of art. Theodor von Karajan was awarded the first chair for German language and literature in 1850, and Rudolf von Eitelberger received an extraordinary professorship for the history and archaeology of art in 1852. Eduard Hanslick then attained the first post for the history and aesthetics of music at any German language university. Thanks to the acknowledgement of his now infamous treatise On the Musically Beautiful as a habilitation dissertation, Hanslick became a private lecturer in 1856, being granted a salaried position in 1861, which finally turned into the first tenured position in musicology as of 1870. His successor Guido Adler ultimately established the Department of Musicology in 1901. The first chair for musicology in Germany was then awarded to Gustav Jakobsthal at Strasbourg University in 1897, nearly 30 years after Hanslick's professorship. Here I briefly want to note a lack of data regarding the establishment of university positions in musicology, especially concerning their exact title, capacity, and brand of musical research. Beyond chronology, the particular designation of academic positions is significant for tracing the evolution of our discipline in different local contexts. A striking example, related directly to my topic today, is the renaming of Hanslick's chair after his retirement in 1895. Hanslick, who besides having written a book on the history of concert life in Vienna, mainly produced aesthetic and critical writings, was succeeded by Adler, a scholar invested in converting musicology into a science, based on historical observation, hard facts, and rules akin to the laws of natural science. The philosopher Friedrich Jodl, a member of the committee discussing Hanslick's succession, therefore proposed to retitle Hanslick's chair from the history and aesthetics to the theory and history of music, thereby signaling how the expectations towards musical research had changed and tasking Adler with advancing the scientification of musicology. Given this brief general outline of the institutional establishment of musicology, it seems appropriate to consider Adler's essay as one of the, if not the earliest attempts at providing a systematic character to our field, which was the youngest among the disciplines concerned with the fine arts. Adler probably took inspiration from Moritz Tausing's inaugural lecture of 1873, a founding figure of the Vienna School of Art History, in which the newly appointed professor embarked on defining the scope, method and problems of art history and took keen interest in delimiting the disciplinary boundaries to related sciences such as archaeology, aesthetics, and general history. This enterprise was in line with the general process of scientification in 19th century humanities, which more often than not was coupled with an ever-growing amount of differentiation and specification on the one hand, and a search for a leading principle of inquiry on the other, which both were expected to advance scholarship to a level of objectivity comparable to natural science. What then was Adler's new model? How did he implement overarching guidelines to make music research more scientific? And from which sources did he draw in establishing the to-be-defined methodology of musicology? To answer this set of questions as briefly and concisely as possible, one has to take a look at the setting from which Adler's model emerged, that is, the political, cultural, and scientific framework of 19th century Austria. University education in Austria was reformed thoroughly following the 1848 revolution by Leo, Count of Thun and Hohenstein, Minister of Education between 1849 and 1860, whose policies shaped Habsburg education for decades to come. His reform sought to modernize education by introducing Herbartian philosophy as an alternative to the reign of Hegel in Prussia, Austria's chief rival among the German nations. Apart from innovation attempts, however, the reform was also supposed to suppress liberal forces which were considered responsible for the recent political unrest. To achieve these goals, Thun used a double-edged policy of outward academic freedom subverted by him nominating politically expedient professors. While his focus lay on updating education and stifling liberal forces, the reform also reacted to increasing nationalist tensions among Austria's ethnic groups by pushing scientific methods perceived as culturally neutral. This way, a model of research came to the fore of Habsburg academia, which was deemed unbiased in terms of cultural, national, and ethnic origin: positivism. Although Thun nurtured positivism primarily as a way of modernization and appeasement, it was moreover supposed to encourage a unification of Habsburg territories by creating a common scientific discourse free from cultural concerns. A notorious outcome of this mode of reasoning, overtly charged with political intent, is the 24-volume Kronprinzenwerk, directed by Crown Prince Rudolf, which was published from 1886 to 1902 in German and Hungarian simultaneously. This monumental encyclopedia attempted to represent the empire's ethnic groups in respect of their cultural qualities without ascribing priority to the Germanic segment of Austria-Hungary. This seemingly apolitical approach consequently had tangible political implications, establishing a cohesive cultural consciousness of Austria's diverse peoples, with Franz Joseph I as the father figure uniting the empire. Funnily enough, positivistic scholarship, as a methodical orientation perceived as culturally neutral, was thus the result of the specific cultural and political setting of Austria shaping musical research from Hanslick's absolutist and formalist aesthetics to Adler's long-term editorial project Denkmäler der Tonkunst in Österreich. As Kevin Carnes has noted, this ongoing project, starting in 1892 and dedicated to presenting musical masterworks from Fuchs, Bieber and Froberger to Benevoli, Caldara and Cesti, betrays a political purpose by its very title. In contrast to its German counterpart, Denkmäler deutscher Tonkunst, or Monuments of German Music, the Austrian project refers to a geographic location rather than a seemingly unified cultural identity, purposely choosing the series title Monuments of Music in Austria over Monuments of Austrian Music. The positivist tradition of Austrian musicology, as indicated before, was already apparent in Hanslick's writings, who in his habilitation petition of 1856 describes himself as leaning towards Herbartian philosophy. On the very first page of On the Musically Beautiful, he moreover subscribes to Habsburg positivism inasmuch as he acknowledges the, quote, urgency for as objective a knowledge of things as possible, and the need to, quote, approach the natural scientific method at least as far as trying to penetrate to the things themselves and to probe what in those things may be enduring objective. It is Adler's essay of 1885, however, which arguably presents the most important outcome of this historical framework for the nascent discipline of musicology. Scholarship, for the most part, interprets Adler's famous two-pronged outline of our discipline, split neatly into the fields of historical and systematic musicology, as an actual division, with Adler favoring the historical branch of his chart, including research areas such as musical notation, musical instruments, and the general history of music. To me, however, this reading of Adler's essay is a simplification stemming primarily from the nature of Adler's later work. This work indeed focuses on historical inquiry to an extent that one of his more famous pupils, Egon Welles, could identify the term musicology, Musikwissenschaft, with science of music history, Musikgeschichtswissenschaft, in an article published in 1919, the same year Adler's Method of Music History appeared in print. In the 1880s, however, Adler was interested primarily in establishing musical research as a nomological endeavor. While Habsburg philosophy in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s was largely dominated by Herbartianism and its derivatives, the 1880s saw the growing influence of Franz Brentano, professor of philosophy in Vienna as of 1874, and teacher of figures such as Sigmund Freud, Edmund Husserl, Karl Stumpf, and Adler. It probably was Brentano who sparked Adler's interest in methodology by claiming the identity of methods in philosophy and the natural sciences in the famous fourth thesis of his 1866 habilitation dissertation. In 1884, Adler writes to Alexius von Meinong, a philosopher with whom he had studied under Brentano, asking for advice in coming to terms with philosophical methodology. Unfortunately, the extent to which Meinong shaped Adler's thought remained subject to speculation, as Meinong did not bother with answering Adler's question in writing, but rather invited him to a 2-week retreat in order to explore these issues in person. What we know from his letters, however, is Adler's early conviction that musical research will have to employ a mixed scheme. First, historical and philological techniques for the explanation of documents, and, second, induction for uncovering the laws of art. The essence of musico-historical research, he states in his 1885 essay, is exploring the, quote, laws of art in different historic periods. Systematic musicology, however, comprising ethnographic investigation, aesthetics, and music theory, for example, is supposed to discover the, quote, uppermost laws of art, irrespective of historical relativity. Only the combination of both approaches can thus serve the twofold purpose of musicology in general, the, quote, exploration of truth and promotion of beauty. This mixed scheme, devoted to the detection of musical laws, thus merges very different scientific approaches to music that were part of contemporary scholarly discourse, but at times seemed mutually exclusive. Most importantly, Adler adopts philological methods employed by the preceding generation of scholars. Consider, for instance, the works of Chrysander, Spitter, and Otto Jahn, which he combines with the objectivist aesthetics of Hanslick by refocusing musical research on the artwork instead of composers, and adopting the spirit of natural science by letting the rules of music take center stage in musicological scholarship. the connective tissue between these methodical approaches, skillfully utilized in Adler's essay, is constituted by Habsburg positivism, which in the humanities takes on an objectivist and historicist rather than purely empirical character, generating knowledge through sources, facts, and their critical analysis. The broad outline of musicological methodology in Adler's essay, which shapes our field to this day, thus at least partly results from the cultural, political, and philosophical peculiarities of Adler's setting in 19th century Austria. A historically arbitrary setting, which betrays significant long-term effects meriting further investigation in order to understand the constitution and implicit methodic biases of our discipline. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you benefited from or even enjoyed my paper, which is the first in a line of talks to be published over the coming months on this channel. Please get back to me with feedback, suggestions, and any kind of criticism via comments or the messaging function of my Academia EDU website and my ResearchGate account, both listed in the channel information. Have a lovely day, and please don't hesitate to share your own views on the matters raised in this talk.